Hi, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 48. Our first question today is from Diana from Colombia/Germany, who asks, is it known how the voices that people with schizophrenia hear are generated and how they can be blocked?
Yes, yes and no. Schizophrenia. Okay, one of the truly terrible ways that your brain can turn on you, just to get dichotomizing in a false way. Schizophrenia, horrific psychiatric disorder, 1 to 2% of the population. Most famously, thought disorder, tangential thought, fragmented, loose associations, difficulties with understanding levels of abstraction, often going in the direction of concreteness. Everyday sense, you talk to somebody, and after 60 seconds, if they're not making sense, that may be one of your main diagnostic signs that you have somebody with schizophrenia. Unappreciated by most people, it's also a disease of social isolation, not just of cognition, but as alluded to in the question, probably most famously, it's a disease characterized by hallucinations, delusions, often florid hallucinations, very, very defining of the disease. And also implicit in that question is the fact that about 95% of hallucinations in people with schizophrenia are auditory. The famed, have you been hearing voices? So the question becomes, what's that about? Is that known? And people used to think they had a pretty good idea, which turned out to be totally wrong. And it had to do with the neurotransmitter serotonin. Serotonin, it's popped up in various one of these episodes all along. And it turns out structurally, there's a bunch of drugs which are very similar to serotonin, structurally sufficiently so that they could fake out serotonin receptors. A bunch of drugs like LSD and mescaline and psilocybin. Whoa, the major hallucinogens all are mimickers, homologs of serotonin and can fake out serotonin receptors. Obviously, then, what the hallucinations are about in schizophrenia, which is there's something wrong with the serotonin system. And that began a whole futile search for some sort of endogenous serotonin-like hallucinogen that would get released at weird times, and pretty much that didn't pan out. What hearing the voices is probably about is instead a problem with the neurotransmitter dopamine. Dopamine, we love dopamine. It has come up so many times. Dopamine has been implicated in schizophrenia since the 1950s. Major breakthrough then, first class of drugs, antipsychotics that would do something to help people with schizophrenia. And this first generation were drugs which blocked dopamine receptors. In other words, the neuron up here releases a tidal wave dopamine, but because the receptor is blocked, none of the message gets through. And people with schizophrenia became less schizophrenic at that point. And what would your hypothesis have to be? Ooh, I bet there was too much dopamine in the first place. Thus, the dopamine hypothesis, and now 60, 70 years later, blocking dopamine receptors is still the first line of defense in treating somebody with schizophrenia. Neuroleptics, antipsychotics, drugs like Thorazine, Haldol. So the question, of course, now becomes, so what's up with dopamine? We've now gotten indirect evidence suggesting there's too much dopamine. What's that doing? Okay, what do we know about dopamine so far? It's doing all sorts of different things at different parts of the brain. It has something to do with initiating smooth motor movement in a part of the brain relevant to Parkinson's disease. It helps regulate the release of this hormone prolactin. And in one part of the brain, dopamine famously is about pleasure and reward. Part of the brain called the mesolimbic dopamine system, involving two horrible multisyllabic brain regions, one called the ventral tegmental area, the other called the nucleus accumbens. And dopamine is about pleasure, reward, cocaine, euphorians work on that. That's the old model. Dopamine is about feeling pleasure. And what people learned over the years is, much more accurately, dopamine is not about feeling pleasure. Dopamine is about anticipating pleasure. And dopamine, when it is in the anticipatory mode, motivates what you need to do to get that reward. Dopamine motivates goal-directed behavior. So this whole world of dopamine, and that's become sort of the dogma with it. But it turns out that same part of the brain doing dopamine does some other interesting stuff as well. And a lot of this was the work of this guy, Wolfram Schultz at Cambridge, who's like a pioneer in the field, showing there's a variety of domains of dopamine release in this part of the brain. Some aspects of dopamine release, you can have a wave occurring over the course of many minutes. Another domain is over the course of a few seconds to a few minutes. Another domain is sub-second, millisecond type scales. And what he basically discovered was the millisecond domain, the much shorter than a second domain, was doing something where essentially what you were doing with your dopamine was making a prediction of what you thought was going to come next. Whoa, here I am. I'm about to drop this ball. And as I do it, you get a little spike of dopamine, a millisecond spike, orders of magnitude away from the universe of dopamine, anticipating the pleasures of paradise if you've prayed enough. Instead, this brief millisecond spike of dopamine built around, okay, we just made a prediction, which is the ball's going to drop. And the ball does drop, and hooray for you. But suppose instead you release the ball, you get that spike of dopamine, and unexpectedly the ball goes straight up in the air and disappears. You get a second big spike of dopamine, a prediction error, which mostly translates into, whoa, what was that about? Pay attention to that. A salient cue, a cue of saliency, as people now refer to it, which is a, whoa, something unexpected happened, something unforeseen. Pay attention, this is important. And where we begin to have the problems in schizophrenia is that it's looking as if the excess dopamine, first inferred in the 1950s, is not, ooh, the arcs of it over the course of hours are elevated 2%. And that what it seems to be instead is more of these little spikes randomly. And what that produces is, jargon, aberrant salience. You're sitting there and your dopamine system, because of schizophrenia, genes, all the story with this, but for whatever reasons, you suddenly get these little random little spikes of dopamine now and then. And what each one of those does is make you sit up, in effect, and say, whoa, something really unexpected and important just happened. You are looking for salience in completely random places. And what happens with that? You are searching for attribution. If you have schizophrenia and you get one of these random spikes, one of these random spikes a second after you're in a restaurant and you noticed the person at the next table briefly glanced at you. Boom! Then you get a spike. Whoa! That was why are they monitoring me? Why are they spying on me? This is a pathway to some of the paranoia that's a frequent feature of schizophrenia. Or, you're sitting and the washing machine is gurgling away in the next room and making its washing noises, and suddenly you get one of these random spikes, and whoa, that wasn't the washer. There was something going on in there, which is very meaningful, very ground. Oh, that's where they have the recording devices or some such thing. So when you've got these random spikes, these sub-second spikes of dopamine, it produces this aberrant sense of importance, significance. Pay attention to this. Come up with an attribution for why this suddenly feels so important. And what it invites you to do is come up with delusional attributions. Okay, but this brings us back to the auditory. We just saw you could be seeing somebody glancing at you for an instant, spike of dopamine. Ooh, they are spying on me. That's the assassin who's come to get me. All that realm of potentially visual hallucinations. Nonetheless, again, 95% of the time it's auditory. And this is where there's an interesting phenomenon that people call subvocalization. You're sitting and you're reading. You're reading, and on a certain little microscopic level, your larynx are contracting a little bit as if you are getting ready to actually speak the words. And in lots of cases, when we're just sitting there and thinking, if we're thinking in very explicitly verbal ways, we will subvocalize, and you can detect sort of muscle changes there and such. And what the aberrant salience hypothesis is about is you get these dopamine spikes, and they're coming while you're thinking. And often you're subvocalizing when you're thinking, or when you're reading, or when you're recalling a conversation, or some such thing. And suddenly the spike and the subvocal thought, the subvocal phrase you just read, whatever it is, suddenly seems so significant that what you confabulate it into being is an actual voice that you've just heard. And there's been a handful of studies showing people with schizophrenia, when they are reading, when their subvocalizations have more dynamic muscle movement, the whole system is sort of boosted up there a bit, but mainly you're just like thinking of something and your larynx are vibrating there a little bit, going about their own business and being subvocal, and you get this spike of dopamine, and suddenly whatever it is seems so relevant and so critical and so important that it's practically as if it was a voice in your head telling you that. So that's sort of one of the leading theories these days. There's a whole bunch, but that I think seems like the most credible one. So as usual, that explains everything and nothing. It explains how you can attach wildly aberrant significance to random little glitches of subvocalizations, a glance of a person, an offhanded thought, and somehow confabulate that into being of vast significance. The question then becomes, why is it often vast significance that is menacing, that is threatening? You get people with schizophrenia and the voices are a huge percent of the time mocking, demeaning, you're worthless, and the question becomes, why does it go in that direction? I think that's where the psychology of the disease becomes most pertinent. But the main thing is you have these little random blips of dopamine now and then, still not clear what that's about. And what that does is make you really pay attention to totally random stuff. And because of the vividness of it, the salience of it, you come up with some sort of attribution. And when it's thoughts that are just rumbling along in your head being subvocalized, this is so compelling, you turn it into a voice in your head.
Okay, so this wasn't a question per se, but Bill said, I noticed that you possibly have brachydactyl type D. Your response?
Brachydactylism. The questioner is not pointing out that one of my great grandparents was a pterodactyl. It's a different meaning entirely. Brachydactyl is, I guess it counts as a genetic abnormality. It's a genetic quirk. It's a mutationally driven thing. You got short, stubby fingers. You've got dramatically short, stubby fingers, which I do, and short, stubby toes. And being brachydactyl is when you've got something wrong with the bone development in your fingers, and some subtypes of brachydactylism, you actually are missing a digit, and other ones, one of the digits is shortened a lot. So yes, I am brachydactyl. It comes in a bunch of different versions. The questioner was guessing from his keen observations that I am brachydactyl type D, which is where it's only your thumbs and your big toes are shortened, club thumbed. In actuality, I count as having brachydactyl A1 subtype, which is when it's all your fingers, which is technically the length of the fingers versus the width of your palm, the length of your toes versus the width of your feet. And I have like quintuple feet there that people in Kenya used to make fun of my feet as to how much they looked like baboons. What's this about? This is like this whole array, this family of these brachydactyl disorders. You can have only your pinky and thumb. That's a different subtype. 2, 3, and 4, or just one, type D, or all 5, type A1, which I have. What's that about? It's mutations in a family of proteins that are involved in bone development. And when they are mutated, this is like just one of these measures of how much fun scientists have when they're cutting loose. When this protein is in the mutated form and you see it being expressed in a cell, it looks very spiky on the surface of the cell. And the first person contemplating this decided that it looked like spikes on a hedgehog. And thus, this whole family of genes and the proteins they code for are named hedgehog. You've got Indian hedgehog protein, you've got desert hedgehog protein. The version when it's only your thumb, I believe, is only a mutation in the Indian hedgehog protein. When you've got all 5, it's in the excitingly named sonic hedgehog pathway. Sonic hedgehog, I've been informed by my offspring, was Sonic the Hedgehog, some sort of video game or movie or such, and somehow that was pirated into this. So you got this whole family of these proteins, and there's mutations, and as a result you get weird growth of bones. Okay, so what are the consequences of being brachydactyl? Very kindly, most of the papers you look on it say that this really is of no impact whatsoever except for cosmetic, and not only cosmetic, but one's sense of manhood, because of course people start with all those stupid things about, oh, the size of your hands, and those implications a la our new President Trump. So that's that domain. But for me personally, it's been highly consequential, because in my youth I was a very serious pianist, and I have the world's worst fingers for playing the piano. My fingers barely fit between the 2 black keys. I can barely reach an octave. If I put my mind to it, I can hit 3 notes at once with my thumbs. And so that has been a great challenge for me. But, one of those when the going gets tough and mother of invention. What I've done as a compensation is sort of my piano area was a fairly specialized one. This harking back a couple of weeks, talking about religion versus religiosity, there was that quote from that evolutionary biologist Jerry Coyne: in religion, faith is a virtue; in science, faith is a sin. And for me, what it works out to be is when you're playing Mozart, brachydactylism is a disaster. When you're playing hideous, loud, clangy, concussive, percussive, dissonant 20th century piano, brachydactylism is a major plus. So that's my compensation for genetics.
All right, finally, we've had a few questions about fiction, such as the one from Florent from France, who asks, do you think fiction is more effective than nonfiction at conveying ideas, such as the idea of determinism?
Well, I know next to nothing about fiction, but my gut is to say no, that it's not more effective, but it probably can be as effective in the right setting. One of the stories that made a huge impact on me way back when was Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener, where Bartleby decides, as this grand act of agency, of curmudgeonly agency, that he's not going to work, and he's not going to move, and he's not going to eat because he would prefer not to, and he starves to death. And it's a great teaching tool about, I don't know what, agency and the extreme beliefs and free will, what major depression could look like in a character, because there was a lot to think that was going on, philosophical stoicism. So yeah, literature can be great for very vividly teaching something, but I think when it's good literature, the whole point is that there's ambiguity as to what everyone's motivations were. And it's in that context that people have done some very interesting research, starting off sort of jump-started a guy named David Comer and Emmanuel Castano at the New School for Social Research in New York and Manhattan, which is a very unlikely place to produce a paper published in the journal Science, but they published a paper there looking at this phenomenon, theory of mind. Big developmental thing, theory of mind, the whole notion when you can understand somebody else has different thoughts than you do. Somebody else has different information which motivates their behavior. That is a stepping stone towards somebody else has different feelings than you do. Somebody else could be in pain when you are not. Sort of heading towards a capacity for empathy, theory of mind. Developmental psychologists love it. Theory of mind. Typically, kids get theory of mind between ages 3 and 4. Both you and your brother got it on the very mornings of your third birthdays. Theory of mind. Do you understand that there is not a continuum between what you know and what someone else's knows, that there are barriers, that there are sort of boundaries to you? You don't spread out everywhere. Classic sort of test that's done with it. The Mary Ann test, the Mary Jane, the Billie Jean, the Norma Jean, something or other. Okay, this so-named little girl has her favorite doll, and every morning before she goes off to school, she puts her doll in toy box number 1. And today you get to see her mother come in and move the doll from toy box number 1 to toy box number 2 while Mary Ann Jean Norma is off at school. And then she comes back, and the question the researcher asks the child is, so where is she going to look for her doll? And if you don't yet have theory of mind, you say, oh, in box number 2, because that's where it is. I saw her mother put in it. I know it's in there, so she must know it's in there. There's a continuity. There's no ego boundaries between me and her. And then sort of the landmark achievement of theory of mind is the first time a kid is able to say, ah, she's going to go look in box 1 because she doesn't know it's in box 2. I know it's in box 2, but she doesn't. And thus her behavior is going to be motivated by information she has that I don't, or that she doesn't have, which I do. And so that's theory of mind. And it can get more and more complicated developmentally, and theory of mind, cognitive theory of mind, emotional theory of mind, they have different information than you have. Theory of mind, this character has different information than that character, and thus explaining their behaviors. So there's all sorts of ways of looking at the sophistication of somebody's theory of mind. So in this paper, they started off with a first experiment that seemed like kind of an unfair slam dunk, because they asked, okay, so if you have people read some fiction, or if you have people read some nonfiction, which improves your theory of mind more? Like, whoa, big surprise. Reading fiction does it more. And where this seemed like kind of a, like, tilting the playing field to their advantage, you looked at the nonfiction that they had some of these test subjects read. One of them was called How the Potato Changed the World, and I couldn't resist looking up the article, and whoa, does the potato have an interesting history, and how the Incans figured out that breeding it not to be totally toxic. In any case, that's not a good way of teaching theory of mind, I would think. So the first experiment, they show, have people read a bunch of fiction, a bunch of literature, or a bunch of nonfiction, and reading a bunch of this boosts up your capacity for theory of mind, because you're trying to figure out characters' motivations instead of why they call the potato, or something like that. So that was the easy first one. Then they upped the ante in terms of looking at different subtypes of creative writing, specifically the contrast between fiction and literature. with the hypothesis that reading literature boosts up your theory of mind more than does reading fiction. So, of course, we start off with definitional stuff. What's the difference between fiction and literature? And that's where you get into the high grass of all sorts of like theoreticians. This guy, Roland Barthes, this French semiotics expert who wrote about how there's two types of writing. There's writer's writing and there's reader's writing. Is the writer writing for their own purposes, or are they writing for the purpose of accessibility to the reader? Fiction is about writing for the reader. Literature is about writing for yourself. I was very interested odd detail that Barthes died at an early age when he was hit by a laundry truck in Paris, which seems to somehow fit into this whole thing. Then there was another theoretician in this area, Mikhail Bakhtin, who apparently was an expert on Dostoevsky, and which is kind of cool because he actually kind of looked like Dostoevsky. And he got this whole notion that what made for highfalutin literature is there's multiple voices, polyphonic, multiple voices there, as in you are getting perspectives from a number of different characters, or one character's perspective will change over time. In other words, leaving you having to do more work, thinking about whose view, whose version of the world, whose perspective am I seeing here. Other versions, the key thing about literature versus fiction, literature leaves all sorts of ambiguities about characters' motivations. But as you read the paper, what you mostly begin to figure out, at least for me, the difference between literature and fiction is literature is books that I keep saying I should read someday, and fiction are books where I initially think about maybe reading them someday and then decide I'm going to wait for the movie. In the actual study, the distinction they made brought in capitalism, which was fiction were bestsellers from Amazon, literature got National Book Awards. And what they showed in the study is get people to read a bunch of ambiguous, polyphonic, writerly, not selling many copies literature versus fiction, and it boosted up people's theories of mind more to do the more tackling job of getting trained on how other people go about the world with characters in literature. They showed this both improved cognitive theory of mind and emotional theory of mind, all sorts of studies since then exploring it. Just to loop back to how we started, some studies now looking at having people with schizophrenia reading literature versus fiction, and can you boost up theory of mind abilities there, which often is not working all that well in people with schizophrenia. So the answer is, yeah, reading can get all sorts of ideas across. Reading of things somebody made up can teach all sorts of abstract things and get you thinking. And the highfalutin literature version of it seems to work best because it makes you work harder at understanding what this character is up to, what this character was up to, what this character is up to, which that character thinks they're up to something else, and what the author was up to. And that seems to help.
And that's it for episode 48. Keep submitting your questions at the forum found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.